Great. Well, thank you, Marianne, and I appreciate everybody signing in tonight. I assume that you can see my screen on your screen. Is that
Uh,
correct?
yes, Mike. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I will get going here. Let's see if I can just, there we go. So good. I want to talk about wreck and crash mail, not a Macabre collectible. I think when I thought about putting this presentation together, I thought some people might feel it's somewhat ghoulish to collect wreck and crash mail, but I hope to convince you that it's not. I hope to show you that it's quite a fascinating area to collect, and hopefully you'll consider looking into this more. So let me start by giving you just a brief agenda here. I want to talk about what interrupted mail is, and rec mail is a subset of that. As collectors, we always like to have some way to categorize things and structure things. So I'll do that first. Talk a little bit why I think this is a fascinating area to collect and study. And then I'm going to go through a few covers, talk about train wreck covers, shipwreck covers, but I would say probably two-thirds of my presentation this evening will be about air crash covers, and I'll explain why that's the case. And I want to take a deeper dive on three covers that I think are particularly fascinating in terms of showing you the range of study possibilities. One I published in Kelleher's Stamp Collectors Quarterly a few years back, another one in the Collectors Club Philatelist, and then one in La Post. And I've given you these titles here, so I'll talk about that in more detail. And then I'll give you some concluding comments, and hopefully we can take some questions after that. So by way of introduction, interrupted mail. It's simply mail whose normal transmission gets delayed for some reason. It could be delayed, diverted, damaged. And I've given you some examples here. I mean, train wrecks, shipwrecks are examples of that. Airplane crashes, obviously. But mail can be delayed for a lot of other reasons. Floods and fires, war, censorship. There's a whole area of study there. Robbery is a fascinating area. There's a collector by the name of Steve Berlin, who actually has published a book recently on mail that has been affected by robberies. Again, a fascinating area to look at. As you'll see, crash mail is usually pretty obvious to identify it. It'll have some sort of label attached to it, maybe a cachet. And oftentimes the mail shows significant damage, burn marks, water damage. But you'll see in other cases it doesn't. So why should you even look at this? I mean, again, it's a make the point that it's not ghoulish. Well, there's a lot of reasons. One, it is really a great area to look into for postal history. You can look at routes, you can look at means and markings. But what I find fascinating about it is it really shows how critical mail was to communications in the pre-digital age. And while postal officials, excuse me, certainly expressed concern about injuries and deaths that occurred, it was all about getting the mail to its final destination. And I think as you collect this area, you really find out that it's a way to kind of preserve the legacy of people who risked their lives to move the mail. Particularly in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, the whole notion of postal administration was to speed up the mail, to move it faster through the system. And railroad postal clerks, airmail pilots, they truly risk their life to move this mail quickly. So I think as you look at this as a collecting area, it's really a way to preserve the legacy of these people who risked everything to move the mail from point A to point B. So that's why I think it is worth looking at and collecting. So let me start with the first set of covers I got. I just have a few train wreck covers here to kick things off. This is one of the oldest covers I have in this area of interrupted mail and train wrecks. This cover was damaged on a fire on a train back in January of 1873. This was mail that was most of the mail on this train was going from Toronto to Europe. This is the only cover from that fire that's addressed to Europe that's known to have survived it. But as you can see, this cover's got a lot going on it, right? It was postmarked in Hamilton, Ontario, the 23rd of January of 1873. It was franked with 10 cents of Canadian postage to get it delivered to Germany. It was damaged in this fire on board this, so the postmaster in Canada applied the label that you see on the left-hand side here. But even though this was in a fire and it was damaged, it still managed to be pulled out of this wreck and arrived in Frankfurt, Germany, within a month. So it departed Hamilton, Ontario on the 23rd of January, transited through London on February 9th and arrived in Frankfurt on February 20th. And to give you a sense of how the media and the newspapers covered these types of events, and I'm not going to read this obviously, but this is an excerpt from the Montreal Gazette from 1 week after this crash occurred. And you'll see a number of similar stories leading up to this. But this was the culmination of all the work that had been done by the Postal Administration in Canada and by the newspapers to figure out what caused the fire. But most of this article is about what happened to the mail, what kind of mail was on this rail car, how it was affected by the fire. And if you had a letter that was in this packet of mail that there are bags that had gotten destroyed, what you should do about it. And so this was a huge part of what they did. Again, concern about anybody injured. In this case, no one was injured, but it's all about what happened to the mail and how are we going to make sure that the messages either got through or we're able to communicate with people who sent letters so they can send duplicates to make sure that their message gets across. Now, about 20 years later, there was another train crash, and this one is interesting because in the 1890s, that's when train mail really became a huge part of the postal service in the United States. And in fact, there were so many trains moving at this point in time, all times a day, and it was a pretty unregulated, sort of Wild West type structure. That in the 1890s, there were 6,000 train wrecks involving mail cars. And if you think about it, that's more than one wreck per day, every day for the decade of the 1890s. So, but the whole idea was to move this mail as rapidly as they possibly could. Now, in this case, two trains collided outside of Steubenville, Ohio, the evening of October 16th, 1891. And the wreck was caused by this gauntlet track, which I've got pictured at the bottom of the slide. Basically, gauntlets are used where the rail bed becomes quite narrow. In this case, it was right next to a river. There was not enough room for two sets of tracks on there, so the tracks interlaced for a period. And the idea was that a train coming from the east was supposed to stop to let a train go through from the west. Well, what happened in this particular case, the westbound train left some of its cars hanging over into the gauntlet. It was late at night. The person on the that was supposed to be watching the traffic on this gauntlet was asleep, and the eastbound train came and just smashed right into the other train, resulted in a huge fire. Ended up with the brakeman and express messenger were killed in this particular crash. Three postal clerks were badly injured, and keep in mind at the time that it was typically the locomotive with the coal tender, and then right behind that was the mail car. And so those cars, when there was a wreck, they were in prime location to be damaged. But even though this was a major wreck and only there's just a handful of covers known from this crash to survive, you notice that this cover was postmarked in Cincinnati on October 15th. The crash occurred the morning of October 16th. By the 19th of October, 3 days later, this letter arrived in New York City where a label was placed on top and it was delivered. So again, the whole idea was to get this mail through and move it. And you'll see that even later. So this is a crash that occurred in New Zealand in 1946. This was in the North Island of New Zealand, what was called the Manawatu Gorge, which was a very tricky gorge. It took them literally a decade to build this train track through this gorge. It was a known area for landslides, and there were many, many derailments for the first 50 years of this line was open, but there were never any fatalities. But on this particular day, on August 20th, there was a major landslide. The train was knocked off the track, and the mail car and the engine went into the river that you see here, were totally submerged. They immediately dove in to get the mail, and within a week of this crash, all the mail that they were able to salvage was delivered. But the engine driver and the fireman were both killed, and their bodies were not found until months later. And in fact, the train itself, the locomotive, was now removed from this river until December of 1946. But the mail car had been salvaged within a week of this accident. Again, just gives you the sense of how the priority was to get the mail delivered and to its final destination. Now, the other area is shipwrecks. Now, there's not a lot of shipwreck mail. Obviously, if a ship sinks like the Titanic, let's say in the middle of the ocean, you're not going to find any mail from that. So a lot of the mail from shipwrecks are due to wrecks where ships ran aground. or that they were damaged in some way and were close to shore, and the mail was able to be taken off and salvaged before the ship actually sank. This cover I find fascinating. This is from a ship called the SS Eider that was sailing from New York to Southampton, and ran aground in thick fog in the English Channel. You can see the painting in the upper right-hand corner. There is an actual painting of the people that rushed in from the towns to help bring people ashore and supplies ashore before the ship actually sank. This was one letter that was recovered from this particular wreck. It's a morning cover, and I think it's fascinating to look at some of the details on this cover. So it was postmarked in New York City on the 22nd of January. The stamp washed off, but I'm pretty sure it was a 5-cent stamp because that was the universal postal union rate between the United States and Europe at that time. Once the mail was recovered, and I'm not sure exactly when this letter was pulled out of the wreck, some mail was recovered as late as March of 1892, so a month after the wreck had occurred. But whenever this letter was recovered, it was placed in the mail system, delivered to Germany or to Austria, where it had this cachet applied that reads "recovered from the wrecked ship Eider." The cover was resealed with a couple of official seals from the dispatch office in Vienna, but it arrived in Vienna on March 3rd of 1892. So again, left New York on January 22nd, went through a wreck, and within a little more than a month was delivered to its final destination. Again, the priority was placed on getting that mail to its final destination. The last shipwreck cover here I have is one that has got a great story behind it. This was a shipwreck that occurred in early April of 1900 off the southwest coast of Africa. The ship involved was the SS Mexican. It had just left Cape Town early the morning of April 5th. And as it was sailing up the west coast of Africa, it collided in the fog with a transport ship that was coming down south from England called the Wine or the Winkfield. The two ships collided. The Mexican was heavily damaged. They tried to get it under sail again, but they were unable to, and they finally abandoned ship and took the mail off. No lives were lost in this, but this is the back of the cover. So it's got this cachet in German that reads from the sunken steamer Mexican carrying mail from Cape Town. And the railroad post office number 15 is actually the railroad in Germany on which this cachet was applied. Now, I'll go to the next slide to show you why it was in Germany. So this cover had a fascinating journey. So this is the front of the cover. It was mailed from Waldenburg in the state of Saxony in Germany, roughly in mid-February, and it arrived in Cape Town, South Africa, about the middle of March of 1900. As you can see on the cover, it had 4 stamps on it at one point in time. Given that the UPU rate between Germany and South Africa was 20 pfennig, it probably had 5 of these stamps on there that you see on this slide here. It was sent and addressed to a gentleman by the name of Theodore Kasner, who was a botanist who was living in Cape Town at the time, but this was just when the Second World War broke out, and so he relocated to London to get away from any danger. So by the time that this cover arrived in South Africa, he was no longer there. As you can see on this cover, it says "not known" at the German consulate there in the upper left-hand corner. You can see the "not known" hand stamp in the lower left-hand corner there. And so it was returned. It was put back in the mail system to be returned to sender. Unfortunately, got placed on the Mexican. The Mexican sank. That cover was returned to Cape Town, and before any of the passengers on that Mexican ship were able to get a ride back on another ship to England, this mail got first priority, and it was placed on another ship that arrived back in Southampton on the 28th of April. And by the 30th of April, this letter was back at its origination point in Waldenburg. So again, just a fascinating journey that this cover had. So let me turn to airmail, air crash mail. This is what I want to spend, the bulk of this evening on. Why the focus on air crash mail? Well, if you think about the whole purpose of of postal administrations was to move mail as rapidly as possible. And that was the whole purpose. If you think back to, the innovations of post roads and of the Pony Express and of railroads, was to move the mail quickly. And airmail really was the pinnacle of that effort to accelerate the movement of mail through the system. So that's the first reason to look at it. Secondly, flying mail was an incredibly dangerous profession. The life expectancy of an airmail pilot in the early days was as short as 900 hours. When the United States Post Office Department flew the mail and actually hired pilots, they hired 200 pilots in that 8-year period between 1918 and 1926, and 35 of them were killed flying mail. If you think about that, that's a fatality rate of 17%. The most dangerous profession today that you can do is logging, and that has a fatality rate of 0.01%. So we're talking about a highly dangerous profession. But be, but be, but despite that, these pilots persevered. I mean, it's amazing what these pilots did. And as you'll see in some of these stories, I'll tell you, they went to all lengths to make sure the mail moved along. And I really think as collectors, we truly owe those pilots a great deal of debt of gratitude, because they really did a tremendous, not only to show the viability of airmail, but they showed the viability of aviation. And as we probably all know, I mean, we wouldn't have the aviation system that we have today if it weren't for the support of the government for airmail back in the 1920s. So let me look at some of these crash covers and things that you can learn from them. First off, crash cover and the collectability was recognized early on. This is a relatively early crash cover from 1929 or 1921. So this is about 3 years after scheduled airmail began in the United States. Unfortunately, the pilot flying this plane was killed in the crash that occurred in Rock Springs, Iowa. But you can see, even though this letter was postmarked on May 4th in Salt Lake City of 1921, the crash occurred the next day on May 5th. By May 11th, this letter had made it to its destination in St. Louis, and the recipient, jotted down this note to his dear friend Hill, pointing out that as a stamp collector, he might very well appreciate this in his collection. So again, it was recognized as something that was noteworthy and it was worth hanging on to. This particular pilot, his name was William Bunting. He first flew mail in November of 1921, so he hadn't been flying very long before his plane crashed and he died. And like so much crash mail from this point in time, there was a special cachet that was put together. So it says this letter salvaged from airmail plane, and gives you the circumstances. It was destroyed by fire, where it happened, and the date, and then with the postmaster's signature at the bottom. So again, very soon after this accident happened, the special cachet was put together. The mail was stamped at, and the mail went back into the system and went onto its delivery point. You'll find mail like this one. This one is a crash that took place in near Park City, Utah, in March of 1929. And you'll find a lot of air crash mail in particular will be put in what they call an ambulance envelope. So the letter will be so badly damaged as this one was that it couldn't just be put in the mail by itself. So the post office would put together these special envelopes, put the address on that ambulance envelope, put the piece of mail inside that, and forward it on. And again, to make the point of how quickly this mail was delivered. So this pilot was injured in this accident. But within 4 days after this accident occurred, this letter arrived at its destination in Chicago. So again, getting the mail off the damaged plane and getting it to its final destination. You'll also see, especially back at this point in time, that every crash had its own special, unique cachet, right? So I showed you a few of those earlier. Here's two more. This is the one in the upper left is from a crash that occurred in January of 1931. The pilot wasn't found until a week later, but the mail was recovered from that, cachet applied, letter got delivered. The one in the lower right there is one that happened, about 5 years later. Again, this case, a couple of pilots and passengers were killed. In this case, the wreck wasn't found to almost 6 months later. But again, the mail was pulled off, it was stamped, and then it was promptly delivered onto its destination. So crashes were happening with such a frequency back at this point in time that eventually the Post Office Department mandated a standard. So in 1956, you stopped seeing all these special cachets applied on airmail covers, and you start seeing a standard cachet that simply said damage and handling in the postage service. This particular one was from a crash that occurred what outside what is now JFK International Airport, and this was a Boeing 707 that went down, and everyone on board was killed. But again, most of the mail was damaged, but it was salvaged and again picked up and delivered to its destination. Now, crashes occurred elsewhere as well. I mean, you can find crash mail from all over the world. This is one that occurred in the Caribbean. And what's fascinating about this particular cover here is I tried to figure out how this cover actually got to its destination after the crash occurred. In this case, it was a plane that lost power just a couple miles out into the Gulf of Mexico. No one was injured or died on this crash. The mail was recovered. It got damaged because of moisture, as you can see. A label was placed on it. But you try to figure out how this cover finally got to Havana. It isn't all that clear. I mean, one auction house said it was actually carried by a Pan Am flight, and another auction house said it was forwarded by a boat. It may have been both. I have no idea, but I'd
Did
love
you
to
look
find
on
it.
your cell phone and see what day that you called Hilton to cancel that reservation?
That one I can't tell you. That I don't have an answer to. Anyways, you'll also find crash covers from Europe. Obviously, this is one that occurred for a Lockheed Constellation flown by KLM, hit the water and then crashed again. Tragically, everybody on board was killed, but the mail was salvaged and sent on. Some of the mail, interesting enough, you're going to find crash mail that's not going to have any special markings. This is a cover that if you picked up and look at it, you say, yeah, it looks kind of ragged. But this was actually a first flight on contract airmail Route 25 outside of out of Daytona Beach. And in this case, the plane lost power. The pilot ended up ditching it in the bay. The mail was recovered. Some of it got a stamp on it, but most of the mail did not. And you can simply tell from the water damage. In this case, you got the transfer of the cachet from another cover on the back that you can tell that it obviously had some kind of water damage. And then you go into newspapers and you find the story about what happened to this particular plane and why this cover was damaged. Then you have covers like this that show no signs of damage at all, but have got a marking. And this is a fascinating cover too, and I'm going to do a little bit more work on this. But this was a flight back in 1933. Two Lithuanian American pilots by the name of Darius and Gurnis decided that they were going to fly from New York to Lithuania, the first ever nonstop flight between those two locations. When they decided to make this flight, they didn't tell anybody what they were doing. They simply got on this plane and filled it up with fuel and took off, and no one quite knew what they were trying to get done. They ended up almost getting there. They took off from New York on the 15th of July, but they ended up running out of fuel about 500 miles short of their destination. They ran into a little bit bad weather, and the plane ended up crashing. Both pilots were killed, but because there was no fuel left on the plane, there was no fire. So all the mail was recovered. And lo and behold, this crash occurred on the 17th of July. On the 18th of July, one day later, all this mail was back stamped in Kaunas, Lithuania. And it does have the special cachet that was applied in the middle there that says, having conquered the Atlantic, died in honor of Lithuania. Now, I never heard of these two pilots before I found this cover, but in Lithuania, they are national heroes. Just 1 year after this crash occurred, Lithuania issued a set of 6 stamps in their honor. I think the stamp in the middle, which I've enlarged, is one that kind of was really moving to me. You see the sort of, I guess, angel of death, I guess, perched over the damaged plane, and the language at the top says in memory of Lithuanian heroes. And to this day, these two pilots are huge heroes in Lithuania. There are parks named after them, schools and buildings named after them. And even in the 2010s, Lithuania issued currency with their images on it. So to this day, they are honored and considered to be heroes of Lithuania for this attempt to fly from New York to the home country. You'll also find covers that show no evidence of damage, have no markings, and you simply have to know the circumstances. So this is a Balloon Monte cover from 1870. And for those of you that are familiar with this or not familiar with it, between 1870 and 1871, the Prussians and the French were having a war. The Prussians had a siege on Paris. And the only way that the Parisians could get mail out of the city was to put it on balloons and ship it out of there. So there were about 67 balloons that then left Paris over the span of several months, carrying roughly 2 million letters all told. Now, one could say that every single balloon crashes, right? I mean, it doesn't come down smoothly, but the reality is most of the balloons came down fairly gently. But in this particular case, this balloon came down very harshly due to some weather issues. There was a violent landing of this balloon. Everybody jumped out. The balloon was badly damaged, and the basket was destroyed. But this is legitimately considered to be a crash cover from the Balloon Mountain, probably one of the earliest, if you will, interrupted mail covers that I have seen out there. Now let me do a deep dive on just three covers to really give you a flavor of just what you can learn about the movement of mail and of the people behind it. So this first cover, the title that I used for the article is actually from the headline of a newspaper, and it says, "This was airplane, farmer saves flyer, father breaks leg." And this is the cover from that particular crash. So the crash occurred early in the morning of January of 1929. It's an interesting cover if you look at it. On the back of the cover, you can see a little frilly edge around the flap there. And then you see the SWAK there, that stands for Sealed with a Kiss. I figured out that this cover was sent by a young woman who was living in Glendale, California at the time, and she was sending it to her boyfriend, this Thomas Purdy in Columbus, Ohio. Um, what happened with this, and I'll show you the next slide here. So this cover departed from Glendale, Los Angeles, California. It likely traveled on the line, the bottom red line, which would have been from Los Angeles to Las Vegas up to Salt Lake City. It could have gone north to San Francisco, but that was unlikely. So in all likelihood, it took off from Los Angeles, went up these two contract airmail routes and got to Salt Lake City. Now in Salt Lake City, that's where the pilot Potter got in his plane and took off on January 5th of 1929. He flew all the way to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and that's where he was supposed to stop. But the pilot in Cheyenne didn't show up. And so they asked him, would you mind flying that plane from Cheyenne to Omaha? And Potter said, yeah, why not, right? This was at about 10 o'clock at night. I'm sorry, it was about 5 o'clock at night. He had been flying all this time. He had never flown into Omaha at night. He had flown this route from Cheyenne to Omaha a number of times during the day, but never flew it in the evening. But yet, when he was asked, would you continue to fly even though he wasn't prepared to, he said, sure, by all means, I'll do that. So he took off from Cheyenne, landed in North Platte, landed in Lincoln, Nebraska to refuel, and then flew into Omaha. As he got into Omaha shortly after midnight, he was coming into the airport and he hit a cottonwood tree and ended up crashing. So could somebody please mute their line? Thank you. Um, so he hit a cottonwood tree and crashed into this farmer's house. And what you see on the picture on the left there is the farmer. This is Lee Watson Jr. And those ribs you see there, it's what's left of Potter's plane that he was flying. The thing just burst into flames. Watson, the farmer, struggled to pull Potter out of there. And the reason he was struggling to pull Potter out is that Potter wanted to save the mail. He wanted to salvage as much of this mail that he could, even though the plane was engulfed in flames. Potter pulled out as much mail as he could. Watson finally got the pilot away from the plane. Amazingly, Porter was not burned. And the reason for that, think back, this is early January at night, flying through the Midwest. It was below zero. He was wearing heavy leather pants and gloves, and so he was not damaged from the fire. So he was fine. The farmer, Lee Watson, was fine too. But poor Lee Watson Sr., shown on the far right there, he was in the hospital just a couple weeks earlier with a broken leg. He just got home, was lying in bed recuperating. This plane crashes into the roof in the middle of the night, scares him to death. He falls out of bed and re-breaks his leg. So that was the most tragic part of this entire incident. Sadly, Potter's luck didn't last. And again, very dangerous. You know, even in the late 1920s, early 1930s, flying planes. Potter had flown more than 3,000 hours, but just a couple years after this particular crash, he was flying from Oakland to Salt Lake City, flying in snow, and he crashed and he was killed. He flew 3,000 hours and he only had 2 accidents in his entire flying career. But what I find again fascinating on the importance of the mail, the newspaper article in the Daily Herald talked about how the plane crashed, and the very last sentence was the load of airmail was saved and was promptly forwarded today. I mean, that again was a big focus of getting that mail on. So again, we're sorry you lost your life. We're sorry your family has lost their father and their husband, but by gosh, the mail got through. The other story is this tragic flight of an amusing cover, and it's an amusing cover, which you'll see in a second. But the circumstances again of this crash just shows, you know, the lengths to which these pilots went to get this mail through. So Maurice Graham was the pilot. He took off in the middle of pretty bad weather in Southern California. He flew from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City, or he was supposed to fly to Salt Lake City, stopped in Las Vegas. The pilot that was flying from Salt Lake to Vegas told him there's a terrible blizzard taking place between Las Vegas and Salt Lake City. You probably shouldn't take off. Lo and behold, Maurice said, you know, the mail has to get through. I have never not flown the mail because of weather, and I'm going to go. So he took off, and in this case, he did not make it to his destination, and the mail never got there. He ended up, let me go back here for a second, because I think this is, let's see here. There we go. So that's Maurice in the middle there. That's the plane that he flew there. In this case, he crashed about 250 miles south of Salt Lake City. He crashed on January 11th. His plane was not recovered until 6 months later. And actually, his body was not found until a week after that. And what happened is that the plane crashed. He apparently was injured in the crash, but not severely. He ended up grabbing he had a mail bag full of negotiable securities, and he carried those with him to secure them. Left the rest of the mail in the plane and secured that. He was found several miles away from where his plane went down, and when they found him, he was clutching this bag of negotiable securities, so to protect it, even though he was at that point, you know, injured and basically living and trying to survive in the middle of a desert. And he didn't die because of the crime in the desert, in the middle of a blizzard. He died because of exposure. But it's an amusing cover because of what's on this cover. First off, it's addressed to Grace E. Jones, who I found out was Miss Woof Woof Jones. This is her high school picture from 1929. I don't have a clue what these acronyms mean, but HG, JMS, SP, PM, they must have some, you know, romantic meaning to them, which I'm sure somebody in the 1920s knew. Whoever sent this letter, I haven't figured out who sent this letter, but he was living in a hotel, in an apartment building on Hope Street. But whoever he was, and I'm assuming it was a he had absconded with an envelope from Bullock's department store in Los Angeles. He used that to mail his letter. And obviously it was quite an important letter. I mean, this is after the Great Depression started, so early 1930. He spent 15 cents to cover the airmail rate on this, as well as special delivery of this particular letter. And as you can see, once the mail was recovered, it got this delay due to wreck on January 10th, and then it was stamped return to sender. This is one set of mail that never did get to its final recipients, probably because it was recovered so long after the crash had occurred. So it was all returned to sender. This gives you a little more information on the crash itself. So I mentioned snow. So it was bad weather in Southern California, a lot of rain. This was one of the few blizzards that Las Vegas had recorded. And you can see a kindergarten class on January 10th, the day before the crash, playing in the snow. In the middle there is Maurice Graham's plane, which was found, like I say, 6 months after the crash actually occurred. The newspapers again focused very much on the mail, right? It was once that plane was discovered and they noted that Maurice's remains were found, they took pictures of the mail bags and showed everyone that it was recovered. What was remarkable to me is that his last entry on this pilot was January 11th, 1930. 2:35 a.m. He just put down no destination. And again, the newspapers, praised his devotion, right? No more dramatic chapter has been written in the history of the airmail than this sacrifice on the part of a devoted pilot who faced death in the storm to carry the mail through. I mean, just remarkable. I mean, he knew he was flying into dire conditions, and yet he decided to see if he could get that mail delivered through. The last cover I got here it's a fun one too. It's a airmail plane crash, John N. Luff and Harry Houdini. I never thought I'd put those names together in one title, but lo and behold, they all fit with this particular title. So this is the earliest airmail crash cover I have. It's from September of 1919. This is one of 3 known surviving covers from this particular crash. As you can see, the cover was badly damaged. The stamp washed off as they attempted to put out a fire. And this was probably, at the time, this was probably a 2-cent stamp on this envelope. But by this time in 1919, the Post Office Department did away with airmail rates and decided that if there was room on a plane, they would carry any first-class mail if there was room on a plane, if it made sense. And the whole idea was to build out the airmail system. And this particular letter got this very attractive label that the Cleveland Post Office produced, signed by the postmaster, talking about that this mail had been damaged when it was attempting to leave Cleveland, Ohio, on September 15th, 1919. What was fascinating about this cover is not only the crash, but the handwriting on this cover and what it says. So let me talk about the pilot first. So the pilot who flew this plane, his name was Edward Gardner. He was the second pilot hired by the Post Office Department back in 1919. You can see he's sitting at the top of this Curtis Jenny plane. In the middle picture there, that's the newspaper photo of where the plane crashed. So it crashed on top of these 2 houses and fell down between the 2 of them. The houses were damaged. The plane was completely demolished, but Gardner was not injured, and nobody on the ground, thankfully, was injured either. But like so many of these U.S. airmail pilots, he died in a crash. I mean, he left the Post Office Department shortly after this crash occurred. He became a barnstormer, and he passed away in a crash in Nebraska in 1921. But the cover, right? So if you look at the bottom of the cover, let me just go back here. If you look at the very bottom of the cover, you'll see that pencil writing, and what that says is handwriting of Mr. John N. Luff. And so my question is that actually the handwriting of John M. Luff? I had no reason to doubt whoever put that on there, but I thought I'd do a little sleuthing to see if I could confirm that. Well, if you look at the details on this cover, so the first thing is that I figured out that Luff actually lived in the Hotel Bretton Hall back in the 1910s. His name is actually listed with that address, the New York City directories at that point. And I'm not a handwriting expert, right? So if anybody has got more information on me than I've got here, I'd love to hear it. But I managed to find a sample of Luff's handwriting on an attestation that he did for a New Hampshire postmaster provisional stamp. And that's on the left-hand side there. And on the right-hand side is the writing from this cover itself. And as you can see, the B's between book and Berg looks very similar. And the way he made his C's look pretty similar as well. So I conclude that it probably is the handwriting of Mr. John N. Luff. And for those of you that don't know, I mean, Luff was a big name and still is a big name in the world of philately. He helped found the Collectors Club in New York. He was president of the APS. He signed the role of Distinguished Philatelist. And to this day, the APS hands out the Luff Awards, which is a very prestigious award to get from the American Philatelic Society. So I'm pretty sure that Luff, in fact, did send this letter. Well, and the other thing that sort of cinched that for me is the recipient, right? So the recipient on this letter was somebody named A. Roderberg. And I'm thinking, who is this guy, right? Well, it turns out that Roderberg was a very well-known manufacturer of magical equipment and wrote magic books. It was actually very close with Harry Houdini. And here you'll see a picture on the left-hand side of this, which shows Harry Houdini over to the over to the left. You've got August over to the right with his wife in the middle there. And it turns out that Roderberg, after he got done doing his magic business around 1916, so about 3 years before this cover was mailed, he got out of the magic business, sold it off, and devoted himself to collecting stamps. And he acquired a very nice collection of Mexico and Latin American stamps, including this one with inverted in center. So he turned out to be a very well-known and well-connected stamp collector, and it made perfect sense that he would have had some connection with John Luff. So I think just a fascinating cover. I mean, not only the crash and the involvement of the pilot and the effort to move this mail, but then you have the individuals who sent the letter and the folks who received it. So let me wrap up here. So I'm going to give you my conclusion, right? I don't think of Wreck and Crash Mail as a ghoulish or macabre collectible. I think it's really a way to preserve postal history and honor those people who really risk their lives to carry the mail itself. I think it offers you lots of avenues for research. I mean, you can do postal history research, how these covers moved and the markings. You can even look at rates, which vary a great deal. And if you love kind of the connection between postal history and social history, I can't think of a better field than interrupted mail or crash mail to explore the nexus of those two. In terms of prices for interrupted mail, it varies a great deal. And I would say, like a lot of things in philately, it's rarity, right? I mean, condition is not a big thing. All these covers are damaged. They're not exactly going to be pristine covers, but it really comes down to kind of the rarity of the covers, how many known covers exist, and then kind of any other stories that may be behind the covers itself. Um, if you like, I put a QR scan here, a QR code. If you want to scan that, I'd be happy to send this presentation out to you as well. And if you want more information, there's a lot of good information. So is everything in philately right? There is a society. There's actually a group called the Wreck and Crash Mail Society. Kind of an interesting group. They look at air crash mail, train wreck mail, and shipwreck mail. They come out with a quarterly publication called La Catastrophe, which has been published for well over 30 years. It's a short but I think really interesting journal. In terms of catalogs, there's actually quite a bit of information. There's the Air Crash Mail of the World catalog. That's on a flash drive, credit card type flash drive. The American Airmail Society has put that out. I think right now they're charging like $10 for that, which is a tremendous resource. I mean, it's got air crash mail catalog all the way from 1870 up until the most current time. And there's also resources for maritime mail as well as railroad disaster mail, both written by the same two authors, Gwynn and Hogworth. You can get these two books from the American Philatelic Research Library, and I think they're also available online for purchase. And then my go-to resources for other things around kind of anything philatelic is really looking at news sources. So either the newspapers.com, there's also something called Newspaper Archives, and then the British Newspaper Archive as well. So there's just lots of information out there that one can explore. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if you've got any questions or comments for me. There we go. Okay, there, I'm done.
So, Marianne, back to you.
I thought it was a fascinating presentation. I was waiting for the Wisconsin Connect, and I was glad to see it at the end. For
There you
those who
go.
do not know, Houdini is a Wisconsinite.
There you go. I didn't think about that, Marianne. That's great. I actually have been looking to see if there is any crash mail that is from Wisconsin. And as far as I've been able to find, there was only one airplane crash in Wisconsin. I can't remember what year it occurred, and where there is some covers floating around somewhere. And the guru of air crash mail, I mean, many of you probably know him, Ken Sanford. Has been collecting airmail or air crash mail for many years. In fact, he has a big part of his collection will be up for auction with Kelleher's later this month. And I've asked him about that. He said he's never seen one from the States. So, but I'm sure there's got to be shipwreck mail from Lake Michigan
Oh,
somewhere
yeah.
in Superior.
And I was fascinated by the fact that you took time to analyze the handwriting.
Yeah, well, you know what? I saw that. I thought, because I mean, people make stuff up all the time, right? So I was very skeptical of whether this was actually Luff's handwriting. But yeah, between the C and the B I found, and the fact that it was his return address, I think it's pretty much a sync. And I'm sure there was no reason for for Roderberg to put something down there that wasn't accurate. So yeah. Anybody on the call collect these covers or have any in your collection? Am I the only ghoulish person on the line? Oh dear.
Well, John,
No,
John Hodgson's not with us tonight, so
this is Tim. I collect crash covers, and I bought one from Ken Sanford at Boston last week.
Oh, you did? Okay,
Yeah,
great.
he had a few that didn't make it into the auction, so I was able to pick one up from him.
Excellent. Yeah, I was working at the American Airmail Society booth and I think I picked up two or three covers from him. There's actually some interesting dealer. There's a dealer from England by the name of David Morrison who carries a lot of wreck and crash mail. He's got some fascinating stuff to go through. He was in Boston. So,
Mhm.
Hello, Mr. Wilson.
yes.
Yeah, I'm calling you. I'm Jim Barnett from Sisters, Oregon. Sorry I came on late because it's 5 o'clock Pacific time, and
Ah,
some of you East Coasters forget that, we still have lives to lead here on the Pacific time zone.
that's
But
right.
I quickly scanned your piece, and I apologize if I'm wrong, but are you aware of the Hawker flight out of Newfoundland?
No, I'm not. No.
Well, I hope this will excite some of your people because it's Newfoundland Sea number one, and it's the Hawker flight done by a pilot from Australia who left from Newfoundland to try and gain Europe before any of the other pilots and long before Lindbergh. Um,
Ah,
he took off and got two-thirds of the way and crashed into the shipping lane and so was recovered by a ship. And 2 weeks later, they came back to recover the airplane, and there was the mail bag
ah,
with 100 of Hawker's stamps. Now, the stamps are worth 40,000 mint
ah,
and 25,000 used. And each one of the covers, of course, the stamp was dislodged because it had been soaked from the envelopes. So some postal clerk in England decided to reaffix them,
ah,
75 of them or so, and those are quite valuable. And on the back is a statement from the British Post Office saying, hey, we took these stamps and just put them on various letters. So here's your letter. We don't know if this was a stamp that was intended for you. But in
ah.
any event, it's a real fascinating crash
Yeah, does.
story, and it was because, of course, the Daily Mail had provided a um, uh, reward for someone flying across the Atlantic Ocean in heavier than air,
Okay.
and Hawker was the first to attempt it, and of course they tried from Newfoundland first.
Right, yeah, the shorter distance, yeah. Yeah, those price points are a bit out of my range, so be fun to see one. But Frank, you got your hand up there, so
Yes, I do interrupted mail in a different manner. I do anything and everything with an auxiliary marking.
okay.
Plus, I collect all the body bags.
Oh, interesting.
The more modern interrupted mail with the body bags and all the different varieties of body bags that you can have because they're locally procured.
Are they? Okay. Yeah.
They're not a national item. Every post office everywhere has their own.
Yeah, that's it. Because I got one. I had a piece of mail that came just a couple months ago. Actually, Marianne, for the Christmas Philatelic Club, somebody was sending me stuff, and it came in one of the We Care bags, and it had been it was a nice plastic, and held everything together. But the fun didn't have the same cachet as an ambulance cover.
No, but that's our current ambulance
Yeah,
covers.
right.
But yeah, the what they call body bags now.
Yeah,
Yeah, but uh, I've got quite a few of them, and there are some standardized that they basically are done from DC. This is the
yeah.
standard thing we want you to have on them. But then there are other postmasters that do their own thing.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah. Well, the other
And
thing
so
I'd
I've
love to.
got them with all kinds of postmasters statements on them. They basically have the same statement, but at the
Right.
bottom is always something from their own postmaster,
Yeah.
postmaster statement.
The other thing I haven't seen, but I've heard that they exist. There are crash covers and interrupted mail covers that have postage due applied to them. And, there's sort of, I guess, I don't know, there's a rule or someplace, but that, you don't put postage due on something that has lost its stamp an interrupted mail and crash like that. But I guess there are covers out there where, it came to the post office and said, well, there's no stamp on here. Here's your postage due amount. So
Well, especially when there's no evidence that it was in that situation.
I guess so, sure. Yeah.
If you
Yeah.
have it and it looks fairly good, it doesn't look like it's got damage on it.
Right.
Many times they've marked them postage due, and if you look back up at things, oh wait a minute, it was in this, and
Yeah.
that's why it doesn't have a stamp on it because it came off somewhere along the line.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. So interesting. Thank you. Anybody else? Don't want to keep you. Now, of course, you folks, I used to live on the West Coast, so I'm well familiar, James, with the folks on the East Coast not appreciating the 3 hour difference, which is why I used to start work like at 5 o'clock in the morning out there. So
Well, it's funny that many of the auction sites start at 10 a.m. Eastern time, and I'm sorry, I'm not getting up at 7 a.m. to get on stamp, so they're missing an opportunity.
there you go. You just have the bid high, and you can bid in advance. So.
I see. Oh, yeah, that's an idea.
There you go.
Well,
Yeah.
Mike, thank you very much for
You're welcome.
an amazing presentation. And as Marianne said, you always manage to bring Wisconsin into it somehow.
That's right. But I forgot, Marietta. I'm glad you mentioned. I forgot about Houdini's connection to Wisconsin. I should have included that. So
You saved the best for last.
thank you. Well, I think I'm going to do this presentation for the Lancaster County Philatelic Society, so I'll make sure I add that in before I go there. So
Okay, so Marianne, do you want to say something? We have another presentation in 2 weeks on the 22nd, and then we have a Pratim is speaking something about artificial intelligence and cover analysis and all sorts of things, quite beyond my comprehension. But Mike is smiling because it's more his field than mine.
right.
So that'll be in 2 weeks on the 22nd. Dare I say again at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central, and 5 p.m. California, Oregon, Washington time. So James, apologies to you in advance, but hopefully you'll make it home in time for the presentation on the 22nd.
Or you can watch it on YouTube.
There you
That's
go.
That's true. There will be a recording, and this evening's presentation is also recorded, and Jim Meverden will get it up on the website. He's on vacation for a few days, so it may be a little more delayed than usual, but it will be coming up on the website shortly.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, so Marianne, thank you very much as always, and
Well,
is there anything you want to add about Milkapex, Marianne? I think you have good news about the frames, right?
Yes, we have some good news about the frames in that they are filled. So yeah, that's good news. hope everybody has been enjoying these presentations, and hope that some of you can at least join us in September, last weekend, September 25th and 26th, for Milkopex.
Okay, thank you, Marianne. So I wish you all good night, and I will, unless anybody has anything else they want to add, I will stop the recording and then close out the meeting.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Kylan. Thank you, Michael. Very
I know.
enjoyable.